My name is Allison Arnold, and I'm the extension agent here in Buncombe County, and I'll be your host today. We do have a handout. Today, we're going to learn more about tomatoes, everyone's favorite vegetable, and we have two excellent speakers with us. First, we'll hear from Phil Raudebush. Phil is a retired veterinarian researcher and now a master gardener volunteer here in Buncombe County who's grown tomatoes for years in Kansas, Mississippi, and here in Buncombe County. He grows different types and varieties, and he avidly follows what's new in tomato culture, and he just loves to talk about tomatoes. Our second tomato expert is Dr. Reza Shakastaban, a research scholar at the Mountain Horticultural Crops Research and Extension Center in Mills River, North Carolina. He manages extension activities for the tomato breeding program at North Carolina State University and works to incorporate disease resistance and other desirable traits into fresh market and heirloom tomatoes. He's eager to serve our community and contribute to food security by making tomato production more sustainable. And he's eager to share us with what's coming along with new tomatoes into the markets. We're excited to have Dr. Shakastaban with us this morning. We'll start this morning with Phil. So take it away, Phil.
Thank you, Allison, and thanks to everybody for your patience and getting things started here. I'm excited to be involved in this because I met Reza 4 or 5 years ago at the tomato field days at the Mountain Hort Center, and have enjoyed over the years interacting with him during the field days. I'm excited to offer my perspectives, but then really look forward to his comments about what's new and what's coming down the pike, and hopefully that will help us as home gardeners. Just to show you that there's some other resources beyond the talk today that will be recorded. If you go out to buncomemastergardener.org, there are a couple other videos available that were recorded earlier. I did a presentation called Tomatoes several years ago that covers some of the information we'll be talking about today, but has additional information about growing tomatoes. I would encourage you to go out and watch that video. There's also a video on the site on tomato diseases, problems, and pests. We won't have time today to talk about those. We're going to be focused on tomato varieties. But come the middle of the summer, when you start having tomato issues, I would encourage you to watch that video. Also, the Mountain Hort Research Center has a website that's shown here, and these website addresses are listed in the handouts. I would encourage you to get that. And if you go out to that website, and just search under tomato, they have a series of publications and fact sheets on tomato diseases, problems, and pests. And so that would be another good resource. I want to start with the basic question of what is a tomato? That's what we're going to be talking about this morning. But I think it's important for us to understand where the tomato came from and how that relates to how we will be growing the tomato in our home environment. The tomato is a tender perennial vine native to Mesoamerica. Mesoamerica is usually defined as southern Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, and the northern part of South America. Basically, it's from a warmer climate, and we grow it in our environment as an annual. It is a member of the nightshade family, and that includes a couple of other things that we typically grow in our vegetable garden, including potatoes and eggplants. We'll come back and talk about that a little bit later. Its scientific name is Solanum lycopersicum, and I enjoy our botanical Latin and trying to understand Latin names and what they can tell us about a plant. This is one that we can really learn quite a bit of information. We look at the species name, Lycopersicum. Where did that come from and what does that mean? Well, lyco in Latin is wolf and persicum is peach. And so that literally is translated as wolf peach. And it may help us to also understand that lycanthropy, the definition is the witch's use of plants to summon werewolves. And so we have a picture here of a witch, and she has a tomato or some other type of fruit. And it really relates to what was known about the tomato when it was named. And this would have been done in the 1700s. They knew then that tomato was in the nightshade family, and there's a number of other plants in the nightshade family that are highly poisonous or toxic. So when the tomato first came from Mesoamerica to Europe, it was really kept as an ornamental. It was thought that you shouldn't want to eat it because it would probably be poisonous. So when it was named, it was called the wolf peach. And I've had an opportunity to actually see a wild tomato. About a dozen years ago, I was able to visit the Galapagos Islands off the west coast of Ecuador. And there are a couple of native tomatoes called the Galapagos tomatoes. You can see the two scientific names there. The picture on the left is what we saw. We think about it as a tender perennial vine. Amongst the lava flows in the Galapagos, we would find these vines. You can see on the right that they look like a peach. They aren't the typical red colored tomato that we know today. They're very small, about the size of what we would call a grape variety of cherry. You can see that when this came from Mesoamerica to Europe, why they would call it a wolf peach. This is the only actually wild strain of tomato that I've seen. The name tomato actually comes from a native word, tomato, meaning plump thing with a navel. There are a couple of different ways that the tomato eventually made it from Mesoamerica to the United States. There is one record that as early as 1710, tomato plants were brought in from the Caribbean to South Carolina, very close to us. But they mainly arrived by, again, going from the early colonists from Caribbean and South America into Europe. It took a while for them to become established there as nothing more than a perennial vine. And it was really in the 1800s that the tomato made its way from Mesoamerica to Europe and then back to North America. It was really the Campbell's company with tomato soup that I think is fairly iconic. And we'll talk about Campbell's tomato soup again here in a few minutes. It was actually introduced in 1897. It was one of the ways that it really spread interest in the tomato. Today, we're talking about tomato cultivars and how you might pick one. And here's the challenge that we have as home gardeners. It's been estimated that there are 25,000 different cultivars of tomatoes. The challenge is, how do we take those 25,000 cultivars and think about what we want to grow at home? One of my favorite mail order companies is Totally Tomatoes, and this is their 2024 catalog. My wife says that it's my tomato porn magazine because it has pictures and descriptions of around 350 different varieties of tomatoes. So again, how can we take hundreds, if not thousands of varieties and make a decision of what we want to grow at home? We're going to go through some basics of tomato types. We're going to start with one of the first decisions that you need to make as a home gardener. Do I want to grow an indeterminate or a determinate type of tomato? An indeterminate type of tomato is often called a vining type tomato. And that's just like we saw with the native Galapagos tomato. Basically, this is a tomato that will vine along the ground and will grow continuously. In our climates, these will typically get 5 to 8 feet tall or taller. They will produce earlier fruit and more fruit than a comparable determinate type, but that fruit will come not at all one time, so less fruit at one time. Typically, you're going to need some type of pruning or support for the indeterminate type. On the other hand, the determinate type has been bred to be more compact. It can be moderately tall, so it can be as short as a foot, as shown here by this dwarf variety. It will typically top out at around 5 feet in height during a typical growing period. It will set fruit over a shorter period of time, usually over about a 6 week period of time or less. There are what are called semi-determinate types that have characteristics of both indeterminate tomatoes and determinate tomatoes. We'll see an example of that here in a few minutes. If we look at the actual plants, the indeterminate type, again, thinking of it as a vining type, more similar to the wild tomato that we saw. In this case, the terminal or the apical growth bud produces leaves and grows continuously until the plant is killed, either by frost or disease or some other reason. The determinate, the reason it doesn't continue to grow is that it's bred so that the fruit sets on the terminal or apical bud. When the fruit sets, the plant stops growing. So that's again a basic difference between the two. Here's some actual data. This was from a trial that was done about 10 years or so ago by the University of Missouri. What they did is they grew both indeterminate and determinate plants in the same locations. They had the same environmental conditions, the same amount of sunlight, same soil, same water, etc. These graphs show the number in pounds per plant and shows the difference between indeterminate and determinate. At the top is the indeterminate. And as we said, it will continue to grow and produce fruit until frost. This follows both of these types of plants over a 2-month period of time. You can see that basically the fruit is produced over that 2-month period of time during August and September, and it generally shows an upward arc. If you compare that to the graph at the bottom, which was for a determinate variety, you can see that the fruit is really produced over a shorter period of time, about a 4 to 6 week period. After early September, the production goes down. This shows you some research data that supports what we just talked about, the indeterminate and determinate. That's one of the first choices you need to make. Other things go into our decision of what to grow. One is maturity, and there are some varieties of tomatoes that are specifically grown or developed for early mid-season versus late ripening. I usually don't take that into too much consideration because most of the tomatoes we're going to harvest are going to be over about a 8 to 10 week period of time. Early versus late, there isn't a huge difference in that, but it's something to think about. Another thing to think about is maybe growing both an indeterminate and a determinate variety. As we saw, when the fruit is produced and when it ripens will vary just based on that. You need to think about fruit color. We typically have thought about tomatoes as being red, but we know they come in a variety of colors, and we'll see some examples of that in a few minutes. Not only red, but we have orange and pink and yellow and striped and black. So we need to think about that. We need to think about the size of tomato, and they generally fall into 4 broad categories. The standard tomato is going to be typically 10 to maybe 12 ounces for each fruit, but we have Goliath that is larger than that. We have paste or plum, which is smaller. Then on the small side, you'll see a variety of terms in catalogs and in the stores. Some will be called cocktail or cherry tomato or grape, and all those are descriptors of smaller size tomatoes. Finally, what about use? I've shown you here 3 different tomatoes and how I use them. I moved here from Kansas, where I had a 40-acre property. So I had lots of room to grow as many and different types of tomatoes as I wanted. When I moved here, I moved into a townhome. And so all of my tomato gardening at home now is done in containers. I've decided what I'm going to do in my containers is grow tomatoes that I want to eat. So I'm going to grow typical standard size tomatoes and cherry type of tomatoes, as you see here. But I also enjoy canning tomatoes, and I'm primarily use paste or plum tomatoes for canning purposes. Since I don't have room to grow a large number of those, what I've decided is that I'll grow a standard size tomato for eating. I'll grow a cherry type tomato for eating. And then in September, when I get ready to can tomatoes, I'm going to go out and buy a box of paste and plum tomatoes. Don't think about growing those at home. So you need to think about your own situation. How do I use tomatoes? That will make a decision on what to grow. Also, may help to think about, where am I going to grow the tomato? Am I going to grow it in the ground? Am I going to grow it in a container? I've also grown tomatoes in straw bales. If you're interested in straw bale gardening, there's also a video on the Mocha Master Gardener website. I've very successfully grown tomatoes in straw bales, which is a cross between a container and growing tomatoes in the ground. All of these factors may make a difference in what you decide to grow. Finally, other than determinate and indeterminate, one of the other big decisions is, do I want to grow heirloom or hybrid type of tomatoes? If I look at why I grew heirloom tomatoes and why I continue to grow those, or you talk to people, why do you grow an heirloom tomato? They're primarily going to tell you because they taste better. Then it's based on flavor. Some of it is based on sentiment, and I'll talk about that again in a few minutes. Many people consider them to be so-called natural, but it's important to remember that natural is not a regulated term. What you consider natural and what I consider natural may be considerably different. For those who like to save seed, heirlooms typically have lots of seeds compared to hybrid varieties, and they will breed true. If you want to save seed, probably growing an heirloom is the way to go. The negative side of heirloom tomatoes is they provide little disease resistance, and we certainly have a lot of disease pressure here in North Carolina. That can be sometimes very difficult to overcome. As I said, they produce lots of seeds, and most of us aren't growing tomatoes for their seeds. You may find that's a drawback. They are oftentimes less vigorous. That means they will produce less fruit than a comparable hybrid, and they don't store well. Oftentimes they have thin skins. Certainly commercial growers don't like them in the fact that they don't transport very well and they don't store very well. If we look at hybrids then, the advantage of hybrids is they've been bred to produce more fruit. They're more vigorous. They've been bred to have disease resistance, and I'm sure Reza will talk about that some. You have a much higher variety. If we think about those hundreds, if not thousands, of different varieties, most of those are hybrids where we took the native tomato that we talked about earlier and have bred in various positive characteristics. Cons, flavor, I put a question mark there because, again, in talking to people, what they like about the flavor of the tomato is really based on the sugar content, the acid content, and other flavors in the tomato. We'll see here in a few minutes that there are actually some hybrid tomatoes that outperform heirloom varieties when it comes to flavor. But again, I'll emphasize that flavor is a personal taste. You may find individuals that prefer the flavor of certain hybrids versus heirlooms and vice versa. Another con, again, is that oftentimes is not viewed as a natural plant. So we're going to jump right into hybrids, and I can't show you, again, literally hundreds, if not thousands of hybrids, but I'm just going to show you a few as examples. My favorite hybrid tomato is the Celebrity. And about 2 years ago, they came out with Celebrity Plus. Here are the things about Celebrity that I really like. And in fact, for somebody who has never grown tomatoes before, I always encourage them to grow Celebrity. The reason is it is one of these so-called semi-determinate varieties, meaning it has characteristics of both an indeterminate and determinate. It can be grown very successfully in a container. I've grown it in straw bales. I've grown it in the ground. It's a very versatile tomato to grow. You can see it's been bred with a lot of disease resistance. If we look in the garden store, if we look in a catalog, you're going to see lots of little letters after the names of a hybrid. That relates, as you can see here, to disease resistance that's been bred into the Celebrity against a number of different fungal diseases, against nematodes, against a couple of viruses, and more fungi. One of the real positives is the disease resistance, and it produces a nice slicing fruit or a nice edible fruit that has good flavor. So if you've never grown tomatoes before, or if you've had problems or challenges in the past, I always encourage people to grow Celebrity. My feeling is if you can't be successful with Celebrity, then you're going to have a hard time being successful with any tomato variety. We really can't talk about hybrids without talking about the Mountain series that were developed originally by Dr. Randy Gardner, who is professor emeritus at the Horticultural Crops Research Center. I've met Randy, and Reza has worked with him, and is really Randy starting on with the hybrids in the Mountain series. And again, Reza and others have continued that research at the center. I'm just going to show you a few of the Mountain series that are available to you to plant. One is called Mountain Magic. It's an indeterminate. It's what's called a plum sized tomato. And bred into that is good early blight resistance. The early blight is a soil-borne pathogen. And if you want more information about early blight, you can refer to the videos and fact sheets that I mentioned earlier. It also has excellent late blight resistance. And that's because a couple of these blight-resistant genes have been bred into the plant. Late blight is not something that overwinters here, but comes up to us from Florida and the Gulf Coast every year. You can see here I've shown a little picture of the plant. The Mountain series of hybrids are excellent to grow, but they can be difficult to find even here in Western North Carolina, where we're not very far from where they were developed. Mountain Magic is one that you will find as seedling in the stores, and certainly one you can buy as a seedling online. One of the other mountain series that is oftentimes available in garden stores or farmers markets or online is called Mountain Merit. It's a determinate. It also has excellent late blight resistance. And again, you can see those letters at the bottom. It has resistance to some of the fungal diseases, nematodes, and some of the viruses. Finally, here's the full display of the mountain series that are available. Here's the other 8 ones that at least currently you'll find in catalogs. You're going to have to grow these from seed. You will very rarely find these available in the marketplace. Shown here is Mountain Fresh. At the bottom is Mountain Vineyard, which is a cherry type tomato. I've put the smiley face with the tongue on Mountain Rouge. The reason I identified that is it has actually won a number of awards at tomato tasting reviews. And in fact, in some cases, has outperformed heirloom varieties, even like Cherokee Purple, which is known for its good flavor. So again, just to show you that at least in head-to-head competition in tomato taste events, then a hybrid like Mountain Rouge performs very well, with the caveat that the taste is a very individual thing. So what's an heirloom tomato? There's no official definition, but my definition is heirlooms are non-hybrid open pollinated, meaning that if you save the seeds and plant those, the plants will be identical to the parents. Usually these are varieties that have been handed down for several generations and generally speaking have been around for over 50 years. Even though there isn't a formal definition, that's the criteria I use to think about heirloom tomatoes. Here is a picture of 9 heirloom varieties that I've grown. Again, we can't cover all of them today because there are literally hundreds, but these are ones that I have grown successfully. Brandywine is a very common one. And there are now a variety of brandywines. There's Brandywine Pink and Brandywine Black, and again, very good tasting one. If you've never grown a green tomato, in other words, a tomato that is green at maturity, 2 that I've grown are Aunt Ruby's German Green and the Green Zebra. They're really fun. They have a completely different flavor profile than other tomatoes. They can be a little bit challenged to know when they are ripe, but there's some characteristics that you can use for that. The Aunt Ruby's German Green I really like because actually you can cook it in a pie and it tastes very similar to a Granny Smith apple. You swear you're eating apple pie and you're actually eating tomato pie. Cherokee Purple seems to have some mythical qualities. When I talk to a lot of gardeners, they're always on the lookout for Cherokee Purple. Again, from a flavor standpoint, usually ask why are you looking for Cherokee Purple? It's because of enhanced flavor. But I can tell you in one taste test for tomatoes, the Mountain Rouge hybrid actually beat the Cherokee Purple in a blind tomato tasting. Arkansas Traveler is a good slicer, as is German Johnson. I said earlier that one of the reasons people grow heirloom tomatoes is because of sentiment. I had an uncle who grew up on a farm in central Illinois, and until he passed away in his 80s, he just would wax poetic every year about the ox-heart tomatoes that he grew as a child and how they were the best, and he just couldn't find it anymore. You think about why people grow heirloom varieties. For my uncle, it was because of that sentimental value. I've grown oxheart, and I think it is a very nice heirloom tomato. And then there's pineapple, which I've enjoyed growing. Has an interesting striped appearance. It's beautiful when you slice it. It has good flavor. And then there's finally one called Abe Lincoln, pretty common in the Midwest. It has not a smooth surface, but a corrugated surface. It is one that people like. The final heirloom I'll talk about is the Rutgers tomato, sometimes called the Jersey tomato. If you've ever consumed a can of Campbell's tomato soup, then you've probably consumed a Rutgers tomato. It was developed in the 1930s, and it was called Rutgers because it was a joint breeding effort between culturalists at Rutgers University and Campbell's. The Campbell Soup Company actually had a research farm. And so it was the Rutgers researchers and the Campbell's researchers working together that developed this tomato. Through the 1940s, 50s, and even up into the 1960s, it was the most popular variety in the world. Prior to mechanization, once mechanization came along from a commercial standpoint, Rutgers, again, does not have a real thick skin and didn't undergo the rigors of mechanization. It's an open pollinated beefsteak type. I've grown it a number of times. I've grown it in the ground, I've grown it in containers, and I've grown it in straw bales. And it's actually been revived about 8 years ago. Rutgers revived it and has put it back out on the marketplace. Sometimes you'll see it listed as Rutgers 250. If you want to grow an heirloom tomato that has some interesting history behind it, Rutgers is a good way to go. Finally, grafted tomatoes. I became interested in these about 10 or 15 years ago. And actually, North Carolina State University is very prominent in research around grafted tomatoes. The concept of grafting tomatoes is similar to grafting fruit trees or any other kind of plant. You have what's called a scion, which is the top part of the graft. From the standpoint of grafting tomatoes, the scion is picked for its fruit flavor and quality. Usually, in the case of tomatoes, that's going to be some type of heirloom tomato. And then that is grafted onto a rootstock. And the rootstock is picked for its vigor and disease resistance. I've actually gone to a workshop and class on grafting tomatoes and came away thinking it's probably not something I'm going to do as a home gardener. I can purchase grafted tomatoes, but probably not something I'm going to try myself, because literally you cut the top off the tomato and you attach it to the rootstock. And you can see here, use little clips. And then you put that tomato in what I call tomato intensive care unit, tomato ICU. And over the next 2 or 3 weeks, really gently nurse it along until it forms the graft. If you look in various promotions or publications, you're going to see this. This is the best case scenario. Here's the exact same tomato variety grown non-grafted in the soil versus that grafted. The positive characteristics is that you have much more vigorous rootstock. I have purchased grafted tomatoes and grown those. There are a variety of catalogs that will have those. You really don't find those in garden stores too much. I didn't really do any research. These really produce good tomatoes. And when I pulled them up in the fall, the grafted tomatoes did have a very extensive root system. And they certainly are one consideration for the home gardener. They were originally developed in Korea because they do a lot of growing of tomatoes and peppers and other plants like that in a greenhouse situation. And they were trying to overcome some of the disease pressure that they had in the soil in the greenhouse. We talked about earlier that there are some other plants in the nightshade family. This is one example of where we've taken two plants in the nightshade family and we've grafted them together. You'll see this in a variety of names. This one is called ketchup and fries. You'll see the name pomato, tomtato, etc. What they've done is grafted, in this case, a cherry tomato onto the rootstock of a potato. You grow the tomatoes and harvest those. And then later in the fall, you'll have the potatoes. If you're interested in trying something different, here's an example of where you can use a grafted plant. So we've made our decision. We've looked at all the criteria we talked about. We've decided on determinate versus indeterminate, heirloom versus hybrid. We've talked about the other characteristics. Where do we go ahead and how do we get plants? I think most of us purchase seedlings. We can do that at the garden store, a tailgate market, or the farmer's market. I will tell you that the Herb Festival this year is last weekend in April. It's typically been the first weekend in May, and it's at the Expo Center out by the airport. Even though it's an herb festival, you're going to find lots and lots of tomatoes there. And we can mail order seedlings as well. To me, the advantage of buying seedlings at a tailgate market or the herb festival is that you can often talk directly to the people that produce the seedlings about the characteristics of the plants that you're buying. Oftentimes, at a garden store or mail order, you can't do that. Or you can grow it from seed, and many of the varieties that we talked about are only available for purchasing the seed and then starting those seeds yourself. We can purchase the seeds at the garden store, mail order, or through some seed exchange. You can mail order seedlings. I've done that for varieties that I can't purchase locally and I don't want to grow myself from seed. I've just picked out a couple of companies here that I've used in the past for ordering seedlings. There are others. So you're not limited to these, but I just wanted to give you an example of Totally Tomatoes this year has 16 different varieties that can be ordered from seedlings in addition to grafted varieties. The Territorial Seed Company has close to 80 varieties, including grafted varieties. So you can very successfully mail order seedlings that you can't find locally. If you're buying seedlings locally, it's important to use small, stocky, dark green plants. And one of the biggest mistakes I see is that people purchase seedlings that are long and spindly, and especially getting in the last half of May, plants that have been growing for a long time and are frankly too big to use in your home garden. The reason is that you'll get an imbalance between the roots and the top growth. You can see in the container on the right, there's a nice vigorous plant. It's big, it's green, it has fruit. But if you look at the root structure in that container, it probably isn't enough to really support that plant long term. So again, buying smaller, stockier plants is beneficial. If you're interested in starting seeds and growing your transplants from home, there is another video that one of our master gardeners has done, John Bowen. Again, you can find that at buncommastergardener.org. Finally, to finish my part, I just want to show you the tomato records, at least the most recent ones that I can find. You may find other examples, but the heaviest single fruit that I have found is one from a hybrid called Delicious, and that single tomato weighed almost 8 pounds. The longest plant is actually a cherry tomato plant, one that you can frequently grow and find in stores called Sun Gold. It actually reached a length of 65 feet. The largest plant is actually one that's no longer alive, but grew at Walt Disney World. It was seeds that were obtained from China. It was called a tomato tree, and over the life of that plant, it produced over 32,000 tomatoes and a little over a half a ton. So I'm going to stop there. Allison, you can decide if we want to take questions now or let Reza do his thing and take questions at the end.
We actually have one question. You were talking about heirloom tomatoes and saving seed. Is there a chance for the seed to pass on blight?
Not only blight, but other diseases, blight, bacterial speck spot, and some other diseases we deal with that certainly can occur.
You mentioned in the grafting section about dwarf varieties for container growing. Do you have some other suggestions?
I don't. I haven't typically grown dwarf varieties, so I don't have any good recommendations there.
Thank you, Phil, so much. We're going to change screens now.
Thank you, everybody, for joining in today. My name is Reza Şekesteband, and I'm a research scholar at NC State University, working on tomato breeding and genetics. So I would like to give you guys some updates about our tomato breeding program at NC State University, which is located in Mills River Mountain Horticultural Crop Research and Extension Center. Just a very short history of the tomato breeding program here. As far as I know, the main bulk of the work started in 1976 when Dr. Randy Gardner got hired by NC State University to work on tomato breeding. He retired in 2008, and Dr. Billy Penty took over that position, and he's our lead tomato breeder at NC State University. Randy Gardner is still active. He works with us. I joined the team about 5 years ago, and I'm helping with the different extension aspect of the work and other research. So why tomatoes? Even though this crowd is mostly home gardeners, we love and enjoy eating tomatoes. So I would like to give you guys just some statistics about the tomato. Tomato has always been one of the 3 top crop in the United States. It's true worldwide, actually. This statistic is from 2022, based on the area harvested or total production and value of the production. As a tomato breeder, people always ask me, okay, what do you guys do? What are you looking in tomatoes? How long are you going to work on tomato breeding? And I say, as long as we haven't fixed all the problems. The problem is when you fix one problem, a new disease or a new issue or a new small change in the climate shows up, then you have to adjust your crop based on that. Thanks to Phil, he explained most of the things that I will mention here, so I don't have to go into details. So the main part of our work, tomatoes more disease resistant, then hopefully make them tolerant to biotic stress, especially, for example, In North Carolina, when you go to the Piedmont area and East Coast, it's warmer than Asheville. And most of the varieties that we can grow here wouldn't grow well in that area. Piedmont is one of the best hub for commercial tomato production in North Carolina. So we would like to make our elite tomato hybrids more heat tolerance that the growers can grow there commercially or even as a home garden. We look for better yield, earliness, different fruit shape and fruit color, fruit quality and traits that I will explain a little later, and plant growth habit that Phil explained about, like indeterminate and determinate tomatoes. These are very common disease in tomatoes. Some of them are fungal disease, a long list, and bacterial, viral disease, and some physiological disorders like blossom end rot or rough blossom end scar or cat facing, or when they get exposed to the different elements or rain, they start cracking radially or concentric crack. These are all problems that we are facing with tomatoes. We need to combine all of these in one or two elite hybrids that yields, but meanwhile has better disease resistance. So growers or home gardeners don't have to spray them with the chemicals too much. And they have a better fruit quality as well. We see some examples of disease. These pictures are taken in our station just in the last couple of years. This is one disease called southern blight, which is pathogen lives in the soil and it cradles the plants when it's large plant and it basically kills the plant. And or the other devastating disease when you go to the East Coast or Piedmont areas, tomato spotted wilt. We have a resistant gene in tomatoes, but recently new strain of the virus is showing up, as you see in the grower field. This disease spread by trips. If you can't take care of the trips, which is very hard to do, this disease can spread into entire field and can be devastating, especially for the big commercial growers. Here's the symptoms showing up on a tomato that has a resistant gene with the previous variant of the virus, but new variants can overcome. This is another disease which is common to our area in Buncombe County. Kirby Johnson, you may have heard the name. He's a big tomato grower in Buncombe County and Hendersonville. And our soil is so infected with this disease called verticillium. It causes wilt like this in the plant, which makes it impossible for them to grow tomatoes commercially. Here's how tomato look by the end of the season. Or there are physiological disorders like this kind of radial cracking, which makes tomato unmarketable. This is another example of early blight on tomatoes. Other than disease resistant or other stresses that we have to deal with, nowadays everybody's complaining about the fruit quality and flavor. We are trying to fix or address those issues. I put multi-layers, multicolor on the flavor because it is challenging. The main component of the flavor in tomato is sugar level and acidity. Good balance of those two, sweet and acid, in tomato creates a balanced flavor. And as Phil mentioned, it goes back to personal preferences. I personally like tomatoes a little bit acidic, but some people like sweet tomatoes. Yield, fruit shape, size, texture, firmness of the fruit, and post-harvest, internal color, outside colors. Basically, we need to deal with and combine them in one or two, or the breeding lines that we would like to release. Okay, going back to the plant growth habits. As Phil mentioned, tomatoes, because it's coming from nature, it used to be indeterminate. But a couple decades ago, somebody identified this mutation in tomatoes that makes them determinate, which makes large scale production more sustainable and affordable. That dominated the market nowadays. And we usually call them steak tomatoes. There's a new mutation we have identified, which naturally happens in some wild tomatoes that makes tomato inner nose very short. We call them tomatoes with compact growth habit. I will show a picture and it will be easy to understand what I mean. Then we have semi-dwarf tomatoes. I call them Lolai tomatoes. They are 12 to 18 inch tall. Dwarf tomatoes are commercialized and advertised that you can put them on your countertop and grow them inside the house. Okay, here is just an example of picture from last year that we have these lines in our field. Over here, steak tomatoes, and this is the problem, especially for the commercial growers. They have to transplant, come back and put the stakes in, which adds additional cost for production. And then come every week and tie the tomatoes and keep them straight, because otherwise they will fall on the ground, fruit will touch the soil, and they will get different disease on the fruits and foliage, and the plants won't be able to produce as much as they do on the stake. But if you see over here on the left side, this is what I call comeback growth, which is a new trait we have identified in tomatoes. They grow bushy and maybe 2 feet tall. Because they are bushy, they stay on the plastic and don't fall over on the ground. The main intention is to remove some additional cost of commercial production by eliminating staking and tying. Over here, the same compact growth, you can see this semi-dwarf plant. This semi-dwarf plant is not suitable for the field. I grow them in the field just for breeding purpose, but they are designed for other purpose, which I will explain a little later. This is how those compact grow look when you have fruits on it. By end of the season, the fruit size shape can look like any other stake tomatoes, but will minimize again the cost of the production significantly. The main purpose for this actually is to start in the University of Florida when I worked there. The main purpose is to make tomato machine harvestable. Most of the tomatoes we are seeing on the groceries, they are harvested green and they put in some special chambers and coolers and they gas them with ethylene to ripen them. So the main purpose to reduce the cost of production, can we eliminate the stake and tie and invent a machine, which is already exists in California with processing tomatoes. So the machine goes and harvests those tomatoes and eliminates the labor cost for harvest. Another example of the new trends in the plant growth, the last 5 years, I have focused a lot on these compact growth tomatoes. I call them lanite tomatoes or semi-dwarf tomatoes. They grow about 12 or 18-inch tall. I have been trying to make the fruit shape more appealing, like cherry or grape tomatoes, and bring different shapes and color into it, as well as flavor, because the one main issue with these plant type is they don't have a good flavor in them. This is how they look. And they yield really good. In 2 months, you can get this much fruit from single plants. It will be really good for big cities like New York or Nashville. If you live in an apartment, you can grow these in your lanai or your patio or something like that. Nowadays, there's another trend called vertical farming or vertical gardening. So this type of small tomatoes can grow in like vertical and on hydroponic system to be able to produce fresh fruits in the big cities like New York or other places. This will be a good option. I will go briefly on traditional and conventional plant breeding. This is what we do. Phil showed you one wild tomatoes. There are thousands of those wild tomatoes. Good thing about them, they don't have any flavor or other characteristics that we would like, but they are packed with different disease resistances. What we do, we go find those wild tomatoes and identify what kind of resistance they have. We bring them in, cross them with fresh market tomatoes, tomato that everybody loves, and we select for disease resistance. Basically, we cross them and get F2 generation from them and keep them separate, as you see in this picture. Grow seedlings and grow in the field, and grow field harvest station. And here's the challenging part. When we put them in the field, we would like to select them for disease resistance. The problem is if disease doesn't show up that season or it's not spread well in the grow, because growers want to prevent the disease. We don't want to spread the disease. Basically, we're at the mercy of nature. If disease show up, we don't know what to do, then we would have a chance to select. This picture is taken in the field infested with the verticillium wilt. As you see in this picture, this plant in the middle goes down. So then I can select the one survives this disease and move from there. That's the reason this takes years and years to integrate or incorporate a disease resistant from wild tomato into a fresh market tomato that looks good. Thank goodness we have new technologies at our disposal nowadays. We use DNA markers to identify those resistance, as we know all the biological instructions are written on chromosomes, and tomato has 12 of them. If you zoom into a single chromosome, this is what you will see. These are just 4 letters. For us, they look random, but they are perfectly designed to be like this. And tomato has little less than 1 billion of these letters in its genome, which codes 30,000 genes. Every single gene starts with ATG and finishes with TAA or 3 other nucleotides. And that basically gets translated to protein or different characteristics in tomato. They correspond to shape, size, flavor, yield, and whatever we are looking for in the tomatoes. So what are the differences in tomato? In an example of the compact grow tomato, if you grow the seedlings down, this is how they look. This is just normal determined state tomatoes. This is compact grow. This only has one single gene mutated in it, which makes inner node very short. It doesn't grow too tall. And I just colored them if it's non-CGH, non-compact grow, blue and red. So if I cross this with this, just take a pollen from this, put on the flower of this plant, then you will get F2, which have 2 sets of chromosome, 1 from each. But here's the point. Those letters in these 2 lines are not the same. This is not the real case. I put them here for this presentation purposes. Even with the look, you don't see any differences. But if you pay attention to details, for example, this ATG should start a protein. But this single nucleotide mutated for some reason from T to C in this line, or vice versa. And that basically made this protein that was supposed to start here unfunctional, or plant doesn't produce this single protein anymore. If that protein is very important, like in this case, plant will become shorter and the others will become taller. This is called single nucleotide polymorphism, which happens in nature when you grow during the years that we have these tomatoes in nature, or even while we grow these tomatoes in our farms and in our gardens. Somehow we don't recognize them, but if we pay attention, they are in their genomes. And in this case, one nucleotide is deleted from there. Basically, this can be like different kind of insertion, deletion, one single, or sometimes millions of base pair. Every single nucleotide we call base pair can be deleted from a line and making these changes among what we call heirloom or commercial tomatoes, because they have different sets of nucleotide in them. Actually, it's very interesting. I just sequenced the genome of the 2 tomato lines. They're all commercially available tomatoes. And I found 1 million of these mutations different in those just 2 lines. If you compare 10 or 15, that gets tremendously big. This is just an example of the mutation happened to tomato on 12 chromosomes. And as you see, they scatter on all the chromosomes. So what's the point? How we can make use of these information and use these data? That's how decades ago they invented marker-assisted plant breeding techniques. Okay, how it works. As I showed previously, we grow seedlings and have 2 lines, but I don't know which one of these seedlings are similar to wild tomato, resistant-wise, and similar to commercial tomatoes, yield and fruit-wise. But if I use their genome, I can identify these seedlings that looks like fresh market tomato, but they only carry 1 single gene of resistance. What we do, we grow them out like seedlings. We collect tissue from them, extract DNA, and run PCR. We have PCR machines. And it used to be on the gel, but nowadays we have the machine that gives us the result instantly. Each of these lines in here corresponds to 1 single spot here, and this spot corresponds to a single plant over here. For example, over here, you have 96 plants. Some of them on this single gene, they look like wild tomatoes, and some of them look like fresh market tomatoes, and some of them are still heterozygous. This tells me these plants carry that single resistant gene. So even without taking them to the field or phenotyping them, now I can separate those plants that have a resistance. And then I can put them in the field and select them. I don't have to worry about the disease resistant because I already know they will have the resistant. I can only select for horticulture performances. This is called marker-assisted plant breeding, and this expedites our long traditional process of plant breeding. The other thing that keeps me busy is exploring the frontiers of flavor. Everybody's complaining tomatoes don't taste good anymore. So anymore is important. Okay, when we lost the flavor. So what I have been trying going back, because fortunately we have 2 big germplasm inventory in Geneva, New York, and University of California at Davis. They preserved all those seeds from old variety land-raised tomatoes or heirloom or wild tomatoes. So we can go back to those lines and find, okay, when did we lost the flavor? What we can do now, the technologies we have, we can bring back those lines and cross them to the mother tomatoes and select for flavor. Other things I would like to do is crossing red tomatoes to heirloom tomatoes and select for better flavor. Or here you can see this is F2 selection of a red tomato crossed to a heirloom tomato. So now I can select the red tomatoes with better flavor, hopefully that maybe taste like heirloom. Other things that we can do because of this marker information we have, we can incorporate those disease resistant into heirloom tomatoes as well so people can grow them. This is basically what we are trying to do in our station. It is very hard because combining all those characteristics in one, two, or multiple hybrid tomatoes, it's not easy. Thanks to technology and resources that we have, it's possible to combine all of those in fresh market tomatoes, especially bring back the flavor. That's what we have been trying to do at our research station. When I got an interview for this job, Dr. Andy Gardner asked me this question. Said, do you think tomato breeding is art or science? I exactly knew what was his point, and he's right. As I mentioned, like the heirloom, shape, size, and color, combined, you need to have an idea, okay, which gene is dominant, which gene is resistant, what will be the outcome. You should be able to predict what will be the outcome if I cross A to B or A to C. You can't do just blindfoldly and hope that something good will happen out of it. But he didn't tell me how much of science and art I need to mix. And I guess I mixed too much science into it. And this is the tomato I created. So I will stop here. And if there's a question, I will be glad to answer.
You have increased our vocabulary and sense of breeding on anything a lot today. Could you give us an idea of the timeline and how long it takes from starting a breeding project to releasing it out to the market or making seed available?
In old traditional way, it used to be for tomatoes, simple crop, easy to cross. You can have 2 generations per year in the greenhouse, or if you count field as well, you can have 3 crops a year. That makes it a little bit easier. Even with that, for traditional way, would take about 4 to 5 years. But with marker-assisted selections, that with DNA selections we do, it can be about 2 to 3 years.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about what we can anticipate, maybe some upcoming varieties that are flavorful and blight resistant like Mountain Rouge.
Actually, they have been released. Some, unfortunately, they have not been commercialized.
You were tempting us. We thought maybe you had a trade secret that you didn't want to share, and so you watched yourself off.
Yeah, so there are some new lines coming up out of pipeline. Mainly, they are red tomatoes for commercial production, but they can be used for home gardening as well. Maybe in summer of 26, I will be able to release some of those compact growth tomatoes for the public. What I'm doing right now to cross compact grow with those indeterminate tomato types, those heirlooms, they still are indeterminate. They keep growing, but not as fast as they are growing nowadays. So it'll be
Right.
slow growth and better production.
Somebody asked earlier in some of the photos that you showed of the field plots, your plants are awfully close together, and wondered how you manage diseases, 'cause that seems to promote disease development so much.
That's a great question. So that's the reason for the stake tomatoes. They have to be staked, keep them upright. So there's a kind of airflow from both sides. Because these are commercial production, we do lots of spray. Most of them do have good amount of disease resistant in them to keep them healthy. For the compact growth, because plants doesn't get too big, they still do grow well. Again, all those plots are getting sprayed a lot, almost every week.
Do you have a control plot that you don't spray just to see how they respond to being out?
If we are doing chemical, yes, especially when we do it for the disease resistant or the late blight, we don't spray fungicide to see, okay, late blight, which one will be resistant, which one will be resistant.
You mentioned several times about red tomatoes. Is that because of what the market demands? You think that is the issue?
That's what commercial production goes. We have about 3,000 acre of tomato production in North Carolina, and most of it is commercial production, and that's what sells on the market. Everybody loves heirloom tomatoes. You may buy once or twice, but it's the fast food industry is the main driving for the production. McDonald's or Subway, they only use the red tomatoes. So the sell is good, and then market is good for it, and the seed companies are all driven in that direction.
Let's see, there's a question. Was that a trap crop? I'm not quite sure what that's about.
No, actually, those are just regular tomatoes. We just use different genetics of the
Yeah.
natural tomatoes to make them short.
And,
They got, yeah. Just
and
come
that
visit
we're,
us on Tomato Hill Day in August 15th.
yeah, we got that out and we'll put that on to everybody save the dates. The field day is excellent. Great way to see and taste some of the tomatoes that are coming out. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Reza. Thank you, John, and all that you attended today. We really appreciate your patience. And everybody have a great afternoon.